Chapter 5. In the black cold of Romulan space that bordered the triangle, a lone Romulan bird of prey soared through the emptiness. Starlines of spectral color dropped to single points of light as the warp envelope disengaged and the impulse drive took over. The graceful ship continued on course, its wings held upward like a soaring bird. In the dark distance lay its destination, the Romulan fleet that was preparing for action against Ganeth II. Commander Sator paced back and forth in agitation as he watched the change of view when the Aelia dropped out of warp. To say that he was not happy about the situation that now faced him would be a vast understatement. Sator had been in a bad temper since the last meeting with Kenton, and not even Garnon, his closest advisor, had been able to bring him out of it. Not even Myra's more personal attentions had done much to distract Sator's thoughts about what he knew was to come. Now on full impulse, the ship headed for the Romulan fleet that lay before them. As the various ships came closer into view, Sator could make out the shape of the large Nova battleship that served as the flagship for this sector of Romulan space. The other ships that surrounded the immense vessel looked very much like toys in comparison. His own scout ship would barely take up a tenth of the space that the battleship filled. 4 cruisers, a destroyer, and another scout surrounded the battleship. At the bow of the Nova were 2 troop transports, about half the length of the battleship, and looking as though they were the young of the large starship. The Aelia made the fleet an even 10. A grim frown spread over Sator's face as he studied the collection of ships before him. An impressive fleet, all in all, yet it seemed ludicrous to amass all this firepower to take control of a small section of a planet whose inhabitants would be only armed with farming instruments. But, considering the mission, there could be no chances taken. The commander strode over to the communications officer, his mind elsewhere. "Contact the Delethom," he ordered half-heartedly. "I wish to confer with Commander Darthus before the scheduled meeting about a personal matter." The communications officer complied without question, making sure that there would be no reason to further add to the commander's ire. Sator stepped backward slightly and stared at the view screen, again studying the deadly space fleet. It was doubtful that Fleet Commander Darthos would meet with him before the mission briefing, but he had to try. His spirit sang out for him to find another solution to the problem that this fleet had assembled to answer. The mission that the fleet was preparing to debark on spelled out many consequences, none of which he looked forward to or being part of. After what seemed like the longest period of time, the response from the battleship came through. Fleet Commander Darthos would indeed meet with him for a short time, aboard the flagship Delethum. The response did catch Sator by surprise, but he was determined to carry out his actions, even though, in doing so, it may cost him his command, if not his life. With the grim silence of determination, Sator quickly strode through the bridge doors to head for the transporter room. Centurion Garnon, who had been standing guard by the bridge doors, cast him a concerned glance, and saluted before the doors slid shut behind his commander. At least Garnon understands the implications, Sator thought silently. He had 1 hour before the official conference, 1 hour to attempt to straighten things out before unpleasant situations arose. If his discussion with Darthos did not go as hoped for, which was the most probable possibility, Sator would need that spare hour to talk to the other ship commanders and sub-commanders. Sator materialized on the transporter pad in a green pattern of swirling energy. He paused a moment as he was faced by 2 armed centurions. Both warriors raised their right arm across their chest, thumped a closed hand above their heart, and then extended the hand outward, palm open and face downward. The commander returned the salute as he stepped down from the pad, with the full air of authority befitting his rank. The 2 centurions motioned toward the door silently, waiting for the higher-ranking Sator to continue ahead of them. The door slid open to a corridor, one that was much smaller than Sator would have expected. He had never been on any ship larger than a White Wind cruiser, which was about twice the size of his ship. Its corridors had been much larger than the ones he now walked down. For being the largest ship built in the Empire, these corridors were even smaller than the ones on his ship. Sator's thoughts momentarily drifted to the reasons behind the seeming incongruity. With this being a battleship-class vessel, Sator finally determined that the smaller corridors were probably due to extra armor and the interior compartmentalization to prevent explosive decompression should the hull become breached. The corridors were mostly empty of personnel, but the commander did have to return a salute occasionally. Still another difference between this ship and his own, he noticed after only several other people had passed by. This ship was run at a very formal state, almost stuffy. On his ship, he maintained the air of authority as due his rank, and of the ship of the line, but his crew were free to talk and interact with one another. But it had not always been so. At one time, he had not been much of a believer in a lax atmosphere on his ship. Instead, he had kept a formal, sterile distance between himself and crew, as he had been taught. Yet, after meeting Savage and his crew, Sator came to the realization that such an informal attitude led to greater benefits among the crew due to positive morale, not the least of which was loyalty and respect. Here, there was only the faint thrumming sound of the engines. There was no talking beyond what was required for duty, and there certainly was no laughing. Such a working atmosphere was no doubt due to the militaristic attitude that Darthos was well known for. Such an attitude may be efficient, but, Sator thought, very few of Darthos's crew would volunteer any extra effort for him. Certainly, none would give their lives to save him, if they had the choice. After a brief and silent ride in the turbolift to the heart of the great ship, Sator neared Darthos's quarters. On either side of the door stood two heavily muscled Centurions, armed with disruptor carbines. Few ship commanders maintained a constant honor guard, as Darthos apparently did. When there was such a use for escorts, any guards would be armed, as the Centurions that accompanied him were, with disruptor pistols only. Sator had never known of guards being armed with the heavy assault carbines that were most often regulated only to invasion forces or shock troopers going against a heavily armed defender. Darthos obviously wanted to take no chances on any insurrections from his crew or any boarding parties from unknown forces. Sator smiled to himself inwardly with sarcastic humor. Darthos must not be too concerned about the fact that if one of these Centurions fired a disruptor carbine in the corridor and missed his target, the blast would probably breach the hull and kill everyone in the area, including the person they were trying to protect. The two guards stepped aside at the commander's approach, their grim faces not changing expression. The door silently slid open, allowing Sator to enter the darkened room. Almost instantly, the aroma of herbal incense hit him. The scent was a bit stronger than he would have preferred, but not overly unpleasant. In fact, the odor was 1,000% improvement over the air he forced himself to breathe on Ganeth II. The sweet, bitter scent that filled his lungs somewhat reminded him of the times he spent as a youth in the pasture lands of Vatura. The grassy smell enveloped him as he stepped further into the dimly lit room, which became darker as the door slid shut, cutting off the corridor lighting. The commander scanned the room, trying to see into the dark shadows that filled the corners and niches of Darthos's quarters. No one else appeared to be in the room. Then, in the corner of his vision, a bright glint appeared. He walked over to the metal that had caught the light. On the wall before him, displayed in a dim circle of light, lay Darthos's collection of bladed weapons, composed of various knives, daggers, and even a few swords. Studying the edged weapons, Sator recognized most of them as either traditional Romulan weapons or antiques. Two of the displayed weapons had the distinctive three-blade composition, one large, double-edged blade, surrounded on either side by two smaller, retractable blades, and that made the identification of their origin unmistakable. The Klingon Duktak knives were granted the special center position, most likely some sort of mementos from a battle. As his eyes became more accustomed to the darkness, the commander scanned the room again to see tapestries of intricate patterns and small statuettes about the room. Darthos was well known for his love of art, which seemed strange since he was also known as one of the ruthless of fleet commanders. Sator moved closer to a statuette that was carved from a fine-grained green stone into the form of a soaring bird. His eyes focused in the dim light to the detailed craftsmanship of the figurine's wings, when a slight sound and even slighter amount of movement in a dark corner caused him to spring back, his hands resting on the grip of his disruptor pistol. "Well, Commander," came a low, quiet voice from the shadows. "Did you come here so early just to view my art collection, or was there something else you wanted to discuss that could not wait?" Commander Sator relaxed somewhat, cursing himself for being caught so unaware. Darthos was sitting in an overstuffed chair, hidden in the corner by the shadows. "Yes, sir," Sator finally answered as he moved closer to the fleet commander. Although mostly hidden by shadow, Darthos still had the foreboding look of a strong, experienced officer, despite the 90-plus years of age that he had over Sator. His form was not overweight, but not quite trim. The short-cropped hair had turned mostly silver in color, dark streaks of black hair being all that was left of the original shade. All in all, his features more closely resembled that of a senator than a warrior. "I am waiting, Commander," Darthos replied impatiently. Sator moved in front of the desk and stood by the empty chair in front of him. He had not been offered a seat, and so remained standing. The commander's right fist thumped on his chest as he gave a slight bow to the man in front of him. After receiving a nod to continue, Sator spoke. "I wish to report that there is a Federation starship in the Triangle. It has most likely been ordered to investigate the Ganeth situation." Fleet Commander Darthos gave a slight nod. "That is not totally unexpected. What ship is it?" "Commander Satarlis has identified it as the heavy cruiser Enterprise. He has also confirmed that it is under command of James T. Kirk." Darthos may have frowned at that. Sator couldn't tell for sure. "Kirk and the Enterprise. I had thought he was deemed too useless for command duty, along with that ship of his." Darthos fell into silent thinking for a moment, before waving a hand, dismissing the thoughts. "It does not matter who commands the ship. If they try to interfere in our plans, then we will destroy them." He gazed at the commander, his eyes burning like fire. "This information could have waited for the briefing. I gather there is something else?" Sator gritted his teeth slightly. Darthos was still sharp-witted. He would now have to proceed very carefully. "Yes, sir, there is more. Commander Satarlis also reported that he encountered another ship aiding the Enterprise against some Klingons. That ship was the Ravager under the command of J.F. Savage." "Ah, the famous Captain Savage," Darthos replied with a raised eyebrow. He looked at Commander Sator again, knowing full well what the younger man was thinking. He drew a slightly impatient breath, as if getting ready to explain that which required no explanation. "He is a Federation spy, Commander, and should he interfere, he will meet the same fate as the Enterprise." Time to tread dangerous ground, Sator thought. "I have some doubt that he is a spy, sir. He has traded fairly and honorably with our people, and he has destroyed many Klingon ships. He has saved not only myself and ship, but that of others as well." Commander Sator took a slight breath as he continued. "Savage has shown no preference in dealing with Federation ships. Instead, just the opposite. In addition, he has given us some useful information about the Federation Starfleet." "So I have heard from others," Darthos nodded. "You and some may doubt his true intentions, but I am the fleet commander. It is my judgment that prevails." He stared hard at the man before him. "Is that fully understood, Commander Sator?" "Yes, of course, Commander Darthos," Sator added quickly as he bowed his head. I meant no insult or insinuation, sir, only a statement of fact. It was simply my intention to separate fact from rumor. Darthos gave a slight nod of acceptance to Sator's comment. The response would be enough for the moment. The fleet commander continued his commentary in the slightest impatient tone. Whether this human savage is a spy or not, do you think he should be immune to any action? Should he interfere? Sator returned the question with a steady stare. I owe him my life, Commander, several times over. Darthos rode out of his seat quickly and slammed his fist down hard on the desk. And what do you owe the Empire, Commander? He demanded with rage. You border on treason. Sator did not flinch at Darthos' anger. Instead, his face became one of stony determination as he replied, My life and all that I have is for the Empire, sir. My birth and my death was and will be at the Praetor's command. The room was deathly quiet as Darthos stood for a moment in silent heat, staring at the officer before him. He finally sat back down, not sure how to take Sator's attitude. He calmed down before speaking. I understand your connection with this human, Commander, but it is to the Empire that you must hold your allegiance. All others are merely footstones in our ultimate conquest of the stars. That makes our mission all the more important now. Sator's facial muscles loosened somewhat. That last remark sounded mysterious. Now, Commander? Darthos let out a breath. You probably have not heard then. The Praetor's third son has died. Quarren? Sator questions with concern. When did this happen? A tilted head indicated that Darthos was taken aback slightly at Sator's reference to such an important person in the familiar tone. You knew him, Commander? Yes, sir, he nodded. We trained together. The fleet commander gave a brief nod before answering. He went into a coma 3 days ago, simply collapsing in his command chair. The medical personnel could do nothing for him. The last brainwaves faded only yesterday. Sator lowered his head in respect to the news, but Darthos continued. He was but one of many, Commander, he replied bluntly. If our mission fails, our road to the stars will be at an end. I, for one, would rather die fighting than as a mental vegetable. The Romulan straightened himself up. There would be a time for mourning later, Sator thought, and probably for the loss of others. Understood, sir, Sator replied with a salute. Darthos nodded. He stood and returned the salute. I am sure that you do, Commander. You are dismissed into the scheduled meeting with the other commanders. I'll forget much of your display here. He moved closer to Sator and spoke quietly. But not all, Commander. Sator nodded at the implied warning. Yes, Commander. Thank you. Darthos sat back in the chair, fading into the dark shadow. Sator strode back out the door, his mood and hopes as dark as the room he had just left. For the glory of the Empire, he may be forced to kill the man that had saved his life 3 times, and his ship and crew twice. The man that he called brother. It was a choice that he knew deep within his soul he could not make. Sator had already lied to Darthos about what he knew about Savage. He knew Savage was a Federation spy, but did not hold such against him. There was more to the human captain other than what Darthos thought. Savage's actions spoke more loudly of his character than that of a simple spy. Fortunately, Sator thought, I'm not the only one who feels that way about him. It was time to pool his resources and talk to the other ship commanders. He knew that he could count on Darius, Toloka, and Beryl for support. There was certainly no question at all about Commander Marleya. She would do anything necessary to save Savage. Sator smiled knowingly about her relationship with Savage. Marleya was certainly one person that wouldn't need convincing. 3 pairs of questioning Romulan eyes remained focused on Sator. as he sat patiently across the other ship commanders. Despite the abundant cushioning of the black leather chairs in the conference room in which the four now sat, Sator was beginning to feel uncomfortable. While he knew the three in front of him quite well, he had not told them of the purpose for the secret meeting that he had called. Although Sator trusted his communications officer and crew, he wanted to take no chance of this discussion getting back to Darthos. After sitting in the silent room for several minutes, the slightly hot stares from the other three commanders were beginning to bore into him like a low-level disruptor beam. A sudden swish caused Sator to glance at the door as it slid open, and Commander Marlea strode in. She had finally been able to get away from the bridge to meet them. Sator had managed to convince her to let him call a short meeting in her quarters. Sator studied her features for only a moment. Her long black hair flowed to below her shoulders and did not quite hide the delicate point of her left ear. Her high cheekbones were less severe than the typical Romulan female, but served to make her face only more attractive. Her dark brown eyes shifted from each man to the other as she walked toward her seat. Sator smiled inwardly. It was no wonder that Savage loved this woman. Not only did she have beauty, but also strength of spirit. Commanders Tuloka, Beryl, and Darius, already seated in the spacious area, likewise gave Marlea smiles of approval, and with some relief. Now that she was present, Sator could begin. Commander Sator nodded at Marlea as she sat down wearing an annoyed expression. I imagine that all of you know why I'm requesting this meeting. Marlea nodded slightly. The others merely sat attentively. When Sator had asked Marlea if they could meet on her ship, the Thry, she suspected what his real reasons were, but decided to ask anyway. You are concerned about our mission? Sator nodded, attempting to ignore the attractive features of her face, features that Savage had come to know very well. Yes, I thought that all of you should know that this mission may involve one of our allies in the area, Savage. What does Savage have to do with this? Beryl asked, with a now interested tone. If I might ask. Sator gave a curt nod. Although Beryl was the eldest of the group, he was one of the few Romulan commanders that did not hold age as necessarily meaning he was superior to everyone else, and could be excused from using good manners to those beneath him in experience or rank. Letting out a slight sigh, Sator told the group about Satarlus's meeting with the Enterprise and Ravager, and what he suspected Savage and Kirk would be doing. With some bitterness, he also informed them about Darthos's thoughts concerning the matter. So, you are saying that we may have to choose between Savage and Darthos during this campaign, Tuloka asked, before giving comment to his own question. Between the two, Darthos would not get a Grithus from me. But you do realize that by acting for Savage, or not against him, as the instance may be, that we will be going against our duty to the Empire, and committing mute. Commander Marlea raised her hand quickly to silence his word. What do you owe him, Tuloka? He may be a human, but I, for one, will always be willing to risk all for Captain Savage, no matter the cost. Darius had been silent until now. I imagine that we already knew that, Commander, he said with a raised eyebrow and a slight smile. But do not let Tuloka's words fall on deaf ears. There are many in the fleet, indeed on our own ships, that would take advantage of any situation that would lead to our downfalls. Tuloka nodded in agreement. I did not mean to imply that I would not support Savage, Marlea, only that we should be aware of the serious nature of our actions, or inactions. We will have to watch ourselves very carefully. The other two nodded in agreement with the comment. Marlea spoke quietly. We all know that we have to watch ourselves carefully, Tuloka. What we need here is a vote of support. Can all of you be counted on if intervention is needed? The three men looked at each other only for a brief moment before nodding their willingness to lend support. Sator stood up with a smile. That is all I wanted to hear from you before we meet with Darthos. I am attempting to convince Darthos to end this confrontation with Ganeth peacefully, so that there will be no need to risk anything. He shook his head slightly. If the Ganathians refuse to trade, which I believe likely, we may be forced into war with the Federation. We must take all steps to prevent this from happening, and at this moment I believe that Savage may be the key to doing so. Darius, Taloka, and Beryl stood up. "We shall lend our support to you, Commander Sator," Beryl said with a nod of farewell, "until the meeting." The four saluted to each other, but Marlia touched Sator slightly on the arm, causing him to remain as the other three left. She walked behind her chair to pour 2 glasses of pale blue ale and handed one to Sator. "Not trying to get me drunk again, are you, Marlia?" Sator asked as he accepted the drink and took a sip. Marlia shook her head slightly with a brief smile. "If I did, what would Myra think of me?" She sat back down. "Vaughn, just what are the chances that Jin may get involved with Ganeth?" Sator sat down. "You know him as well as I do, Tia. In many ways, more than I do." He smiled again. "He may try to avoid a fight with us as best he can, but in the end, he will have to do the same as us. Choose between his loyalty to our friendship or to the Federation." Marlia said nothing to that. Her grim silence spoke volumes to Sator. She did not like to be reminded that Savage was a Federation spy. Marlia raised her glass to take a sip, but stopped, dark eyes looking into the blue liquid as she spoke softly. "And whom do you think he will choose?" Sator emptied his glass and stood up silently. The female commander looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears of concern. Sator forced a smile as he looked down into her eyes. "If I were Jin, and I had you to think about, there is only one choice that I would make." Nearly an hour later, Commander Sator found himself walking again down the corridors of the Delithium, this time for the scheduled meeting with Darthos. His mood had lightened considerably since his first meeting. The few minutes they had spent talking with the other ship officers about the situation had ended well. The only problem that stood in the way was Fleet Commander Darthos. Sator entered the briefing room, nodding briefly to the other ship commanders present, as though he were just now meeting some of them. He rapidly took an empty seat as Darthos strode in the room, silencing the quiet discussions. Fleet Commander Darthos took no time in starting. "As all of you know, our objective, I have called this last meeting to make sure you understand your roles in this mission and to answer any last-minute questions." He paused as he looked at Sator briefly. "Before we begin, Commander Sator has brought forth some information. It seems that the Federation has sent the cruiser Enterprise and James Kirk to investigate our interest in Ganeth." That brought a quiet but definite murmur from the assembled officers. Such a reaction had been anticipated by Darthos, but not what came after his next bit of information. Another ship was also discovered to be in the area, the Ravager, under the command of Captain J.F. Savage. This time the murmuring got louder, and more overtones of uncertainty. "Savage? Is he involved with the Enterprise?" The question quickly stoked up the feelings of ire that Darthos suddenly developed under hearing the disquieting tones of the commanders upon the mention of Savage's name. Darthos stared coldly at Beryl. "Is there a reason why you should ask that question?" Beryl remained calm, raising a questioning eyebrow. "Only to clarify our possible opponents in any confrontation that should arise." Darthos slammed his fist on the table, his face becoming green from a flush of rage. He couldn't believe Commander Beryl's innocent-sounding reply. The answer had been too correct. Nearly snarling, Darthos spoke in a thundering voice. "We have a mission to complete for the survival of the Empire. No matter who tries to interfere with us, they will be eliminated. It is our main goal upon achieving planetfall to make sure that the troops from the Argyll and Fentress have proper support, whether that be orbital bombardment of the planet's surface or destroying enemy starships. We must take the mines, and nothing must stop us. He stared directly at Commander Sator. Any resistance will be dealt with, no matter who it is. Even at the risk of war with the Federation, sir? Darthos shifted his hot gaze to the sub-commander that had spoken. Would you rather die like the others, or in battle, sub-commander? In battle, sir, Sub-Commander Nadal answered back in defiant, but obviously trodden voice. The fleet commander glared at the officers around the table. I had thought that I would not have to remind any of you of your duty, he said in a challenging tone. His voice was answered by grim silence. That is all. If there are no other comments or suggestions on how to follow orders. Again, silence, but Commander Sator knew that this meeting was not going to be as brief as Darthos meant it to be. All of you are dismissed, he motioned toward the officers, except for you, Commander Sator. The others saluted and left, Marlia casting a glance at Sator before the door slid shut behind her. Sator knew it was time for Darthos to finally let go of his anger. Now, Commander Sator, suppose you tell me exactly why this human savage has caused such a streak of mutiny in the officers under my command, and why it has brought you to the edge of treason. I do not understand your implications here, sir, he replied with a controlled voice, sounding as if he had been insulted. I am not the cause of any such behavior, nor do I believe I have acted in any way that could be considered against the welfare of the Empire. In other words, Commander, you are saying you had nothing to do with Baril's remark? As I attempted to inform you earlier, sir, he spoke in a calm and steady voice, not only do I owe my life to Savage, but so do the others. That fact will not hamper our abilities to follow your orders. But you must also realize that as officers in command of the ships that will carry out this mission, we must know exactly who is to be considered an enemy. An eyebrow rose slightly. I believe I made that perfectly clear before and again now, Commander. Yes, sir, you did. If that is your will, then I shall do my utmost to see it carried out. Darthos was silent for a moment. Any other person would completely believe Sator, but he knew better. Darthos also knew that to do what would be required to rectify the problem would hurt the mission. Not only could such a disciplinary act turn the other officers against him, but it would also cause the fleet a scout ship with one of the best commanders within the Triangle. In addition, with Sator knowing the Praetor's son on a first-name basis, meant that the commander may have some very important friends on Romulus, and friends of that kind meant danger. Darthos glared at Sator, studying his calm, unemotional face. So, Darthos thought, Sator knew that any decision to punish him for his actions would most likely not occur, at least not before the mission was completed. After the mission, situations may have occurred that would put a favorable spotlight on Sator, making him nearly untouchable by a fleet commander, who later may be deemed as acting out of jealousy. Darthos smiled inwardly at the cunning of Commander Sator. He was learning to take this man very seriously. Very well, I have decided, Commander Sator, Darthos finally said as he sat in his chair, to delay the fleet deployment for 2 days. Within that time period, you will return to Ganleth 2 and make one last offer to Barris Kenton as an effort to save our resources. Tell him that he either surrenders the mines or he surrenders the lives of his people. Yes, Commander, I will leave immediately, Sator responded, rising to leave. Make very sure that Kenton understands that we will use whatever force is necessary, and on whomever it is necessary. Darthos sat further back in the chair. And, Commander, you can inform anyone else in the area of the same. If they do not wish to get involved and find themselves against our weapons, they should leave the area immediately." "Understood, sir," Sator responded as he saluted and left, a smile hidden on his face. So even the great Darthos could be swayed in his decisions. All was going as Sator had hoped. Now, if he could get word to the Savage and gain his help, a needless war may be averted and the Empire still be saved. Elsewhere in the Triangle, a collection of Klingon warships hung motionless in space. The Predator is waiting for some unseen prey to present itself. On the bridge of the flagship for the fleet, the view screen flickered as the scene shifted from an empty view of star-filled space to that of a dark gray speck that slowly increased in size as the distance between it and the fleet decreased. The commander of the 9th Battle Fleet of the Klingon Empire gazed at the image on the view screen. The Grim Reaper-class escort had just decloaked over 20 minutes ago and was just now joining the rest of the fleet. The Klingon commander sighed in silent anger to himself. His fleet consisted of 3 D-7 cruisers, the most recognized of all Klingon warships, and the most feared. Positioned in front of and between the 2 other cruisers was his flagship, the Katar. The upgraded cruiser had brought terror and respect throughout the Empire, and any other sector of space that the commander had visited. The ship Katar was well known for its exploits in and around Klingon space, almost as equally famous as the Federation ship Enterprise, a fact that was well earned, as was the notoriety of the Katar's commander. He was equally as famous as the famous captain of that Federation starship. The Klingon sighed with impatience and some disgust as he watched the escort close to within transporter range. The mission that he had been assigned could have been handled by his own ships, but the Empire decided to supplement the battle group with the escort and 2 of the K-22 bird of prey scouts. The bird-shaped scouts were an unwelcome sight, at least for him. Like many other Klingons, he did not like the idea of using Romulan-designed equipment of any kind. His dislike did not, however, prevent him from availing himself of their use. To some Klingon commanders, being given the additional command of extra ships to their fleet would have been an honor, but to this commander it was not. To his way of thinking, the additional ships seemed to mean that the High Council did not fully believe in his ability to command and carry out such a dangerous mission. His mouth formed a grim frown. Despite his many years of successful and profitable missions for the Empire, the High Council still seemed not to trust his skills. The bridge officers knew that their commander was in a bad mood, at least worse than usual, and were being extremely careful in carrying out their duties to the utmost perfection. In that, at least, his spirit was lifted. He was satisfied in the knowledge that his crew was aware of just how dangerous he could still be. "Commander," the communications officer called, "the captain of the Ventros sends his salute and is prepared to transport over upon your command." "Then tell him to do so," came the angry reply. "We have waited long enough for that Patak to get here. Inform him that he had better be prepared to do more than just transport over." The officer did as ordered as fast as he could. The last time an officer on this ship had been slow in carrying out an order, he was awarded with a mid-level disruptor blast in the lower back. He died, eventually, in great pain and with dishonor. "Kluga," the commander called to the communications officer before the reply was transmitted. "When you are done with that," he motioned to the escort, "contact the others and have them brought to the war room immediately." "At once, sir," he answered quickly as the commander left the bridge. As the door slid shut, there was an almost detectable lightness to the atmosphere, but each officer knew how quickly that could change. The Klingon commander was not an unfair man, but was rather one who demanded the best from his officers, one way or another. Outworlders may have thought of such an environment to be dreaded, and such a man hated, but this was not so. Each member of the Qatar's crew considered it an honor to serve this man. The commander was legendary for his deeds and missions, and, unlike some Federation or Romulan commanders, his greatness was well earned. Yet to the general populace of the Empire, indeed to many of the Empire's warriors, the true man behind the legend was unknown to them. His deeds had been the source of stories, songs, and even documentary videos. But all in all, his true nature had always been left out. When the documentation of his career was being videographed, another Klingon was used in his place. This was done not only at the request of the nearly 80-year-old veteran with almost 60 years of battle experience, but also at the command of the High Council. While the commander never spoke of his reasons for the secret nature of keeping his identity hidden, the High Council's reason for the deception was more selfish in nature. Although they openly said that their decision was to maintain the safety of the Empire's most famous commander, the reality was to maintain civil peace and their own hold on power. Despite his shadowed identity, each crew member and officer, even other ship commanders, knew better than to cross this man. They fully respected personal power and his experience in combat, and none, at least no one that still lived, ever dared remind the commander of his one failure. The Klingon commanders waited in the war room for the fleet commander to come in, each loudly discussing what they thought the mission would entail. The discussions had nearly reached the point of open brawling when the doors slid aside. The noisy group fell silent as the commander strode in and sat in the head chair, his face hidden by shadows, as was his intended design when he had the room built. "Before we begin," he said in a deep voice that did not belay its ominous tone, "I want an explanation for your late arrival, Captain Narok." The Imperial Klingon stood up rapidly to salute. "I regret the lack of speed I could muster from my engines, Fleet Commander, but I had received some information from one of our ships near the Federation area of the Triangle that may be important to our mission. And for what you deemed important information, you have held this fleet waiting for 5 hours. This information had better be important to me, Captain." "Yes, sir," the officer responded respectfully, keeping his eyes somewhat lowered. "The information regarded the fate of the ships Kataga, Scourge, and Ranthor." "That fleet is under the command of Captain Kaga?" The officer stared into the shadow, trying to make eye contact, but could not penetrate the darkness, causing him to remain unsettled. "Yes, sir, it was." "Explain. What do you mean, was?" "The 3 ships were destroyed, along with Kaga's warp shuttle, by what seems to be 2 ships, a Federation cruiser and a trade ship that operates within the Triangle." The commander was beginning to get impatient again at the slow flow of hard facts. "What ships, Captain?" he demanded, wishing he had a pain stick to prod the answers from the leather-clad figure. "The Federation ship Enterprise." The man's eyes shifted to the other officers before he finished. "Sir." The name caught the commander's full attention. "And who was its captain?" Narok paused a moment. "That was the unusual part, sir. Based on our records, the commander of the ship was supposedly relieved of command, and that this ship had been decommissioned." The fleet commander began to boil and pounded his fist on the table in rage. "Who?" Narok jumped back. "Kirk." "James T. Kirk?" he demanded, causing the others to momentarily move back in fear. "Yes, Commander," he replied, unsure of how he should have replied, if at all. "And the ship Ravager." The commander fell silent for a moment. Then he spoke in a calm, evil tone. "So, Kirk and Savage have found each other." The light caught his smile. "Excellent. What was their direction?" Feeling somewhat relieved now, and not fearing for his life, the captain mentally relaxed. They had entered Federation space for a time, but then they set course for the Ganeth system. The Klingon commander steepled his fingers. Even better, then. I just may have a surprise for them before they get there, he said quietly. Very well, Commander Narek. Your tardiness will be forgotten. This time. Thank you, sir, he replied with a quick head bow. This information is aptly timed with our mission, the fleet commander began. It has come to our attention that the Romulans have found something of great interest in the Ganeth sector. So interesting, in fact, that they have assembled a fleet of their own that includes a battleship and 2 troop transports. Sir, that would mean that they are intent on taking some planetary body or space station. He almost growled at being interrupted. That is correct. Our intelligence shows nothing in that area that is of interest, other than one planet whose population is devoted to, he spoke with mild disgust, farming. The others facially reacted in the same manner as he continued his briefing. But since our Romulan allies have found something so interesting that they would form an invasion fleet, and now that the Federation appears to be interested as well, we have been ordered to go to Ganeth 2 and investigate ourselves. If there is anything of benefit, we will either claim it for the Empire or destroy it and those who oppose us. The officers cheered for success, but quickly became silent when they realized that the commander was not done. Understand this, commanders. There is a chance for honor and glory for all. But also understand, if we meet the Federation ship or the Ravager, they are not to be destroyed until Kirk and Savage are captured. He outstretched his right hand and clenched it slowly. I want those 2 before me alive, so that I can personally crush the life out of them. If anyone takes that from me, he paused as he sat higher in the chair, they will not meet an honorable death. Is that understood? Each of the officers quickly nodded. Good. You are dismissed. We set course for the Ganeth system immediately, but we stay in the darkness and watch what happens before we attack. I want to know exactly what is going on. The ship commanders left, saluting and giving their promise of success. The commander was now left alone in the room in darkness. Now, Kirk, my old foe, the commander spoke out loud, we will meet again, and this time we will finish what we started so long ago. This time there will be no Organians to stop me. He sat forward, the room lighting showing his face, and it was not that of an Imperial Klingon, but rather the Klingon-human fusion of the old days. He smiled broadly. Then, Kirk, you will know why I am called Kor the Ruthless. The empty room echoed with his devilish laughter. Chapter 6. Captain James T. Kirk stepped onto the main bridge and gazed at the blackened walls where multiple electrical fires had erupted. The air still had the sharp smell of ozone and the stench of burnt flesh. He slowly walked over to the command chair, staring at the dried blood that lay both at the pedestal of the chair and on the chair itself. The back cushion had a badly torn area from where the support beam had pierced Henley's body, traveled through and stopped when it struck the metal of the chair's back. How could this have happened? Kirk asked himself. He tightly closed his eyes as the mental vision appeared of Henley sitting slumped in the chair, with 8 feet of metal protruding from his chest. Although Kirk had not actually seen the body, it was not hard to imagine. He shook his head clear to vision, but when he opened his eyes to see the blood again, he knew that the vision would not be so easy to dismiss. Glancing about the various duty stations, Kirk saw the burnt and melted panels that the repair crew was replacing. Ghosts of dead crew, burned and smoldering, flitted across his vision, his sense of smell suddenly picking up a stronger scent of fire and burnt flesh. Had I done what my gut had told me to do, Kirk thought, relieve Henley, these people would still be alive. Kirk blinked again before he averted his eyes to focus on the repair crew and the officer that was directing their efforts. Though he had seen his fair share of death, Kirk's voice was still choked. "How much longer, Scotty?" Scott had his face almost immersed in the open navigation console. At first, he acted as though he had not heard Kirk, but then raised his soot-marked grim face. "Just another hour or so, sir. I'm putting the finishing touches on it now. The damage was not as bad as it looked, but bad enough." Kirk looked around and nodded. Another hour. Scott looked at Kirk's grim face for a moment. "I'll do me best to get you fit for sailing, Captain." Kirk tossed a half-hearted smile back at Scott. He suddenly felt very tired. He turned to leave, but paused for a moment by the command chair. That could have just as well have been me, he thought. Again, he shook his thoughts loose and left the bridge for Scott and the repair crew. Montgomery Scott's gaze followed Kirk into the turbolift. He noticed that Kirk didn't even turn to face the bridge as the door slid shut. It was the first time in his memory that Kirk had neglected to do so. Scott breathed in deeply. He had known James Kirk for nearly 30 years now, far long enough to know what the man was thinking when he saw the damage and when he left. After a run-in with that devil Khan and the Klingon captain that had cost Kirk his son, and the various others that set Kirk up for the murder of the Klingon High Chancellor, such a scene as this was near too much to take. "Mr. Winstall," Scott called to one of the repair technicians nearby, "make sure that we get all that blood cleaned up off the floor, and a way to clean and repair the chair, too. The replacement bridge crew may be reminded of what happened here." "Aye, sir," the crewman replied. "I doubt the chair will clean up, though. We may have to switch it out with the one on the auxiliary bridge." "Do what you need to, man," Scott replied, almost angry at the tone of the crewman. "But make sure it gets done before Captain Kirk comes back up." In his quarters, Kirk leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. He had the hour to relax, somewhat. The bed had been inviting, but as exhausted as he was, Kirk knew that once he lay body to bed, it would be difficult to get back up within the given hour. His eyes felt raw for some reason. It couldn't be from lack of sleep, although if everything had been as it used to be, he would have been working his 5th hour overtime. Not that he had never done so before, or for longer, but he was much younger in those days. No, it was the thought of Henley and the bridge crew being killed that nagged at him. It seemed as though there was something that he should have done, but hadn't. A soft chime filled the room. Kirk ignored it both the first through the third time it sounded. Only when the door slid open did he sit up and look of annoyance at the person that had disturbed his thoughts. "A little deaf, are we, Jim?" McCoy asked, standing in the doorway. Getting no reply other than an exhausted look, he walked on in to stand by the desk. "Tired?" "Yes," Kirk replied simply. "Are you sure it's not the guilts that have you tired out?" McCoy asked softly. This was not the first time they had such a talk with Kirk. Kirk sat back in his chair silent. He shrugged as he clenched his right hand into a fist. "I don't know, Bones. I feel like I should have done something, and that if I had, this wouldn't have happened." McCoy sat down. "And just what is it that you should have done? It wasn't your place, you know." Kirk stood up rapidly, angry at himself. "Damn it, Bones. I should have yanked Henley's ass out of that chair and gotten the ship out of there." "But you didn't," McCoy said loudly, not quite in anger, but in a serious tone. "And because of that, you're going to blame yourself for what happened." "Yes, I knew what to do, but I let Henley whip me down like a cadet." McCoy frowned. "And this has happened to you, say, 20 years ago? What would you have done in Henley's place if one of those star-based desk jockeys was telling you what to do?" Kirk started to blurt out an answer, but stopped himself. He let his anger cool as he thought. What would he have done in Henley's case? He wanted to say that he would have known it was a trap and not been suckered in. But in his heart, Kirk knew better. Oh, he may have recognized the trap for what it was, but would just as likely have continued to head, just to spite whoever it was that was telling him that he couldn't do it. It wasn't a pleasant thought. McCoy stood up to stand beside Kirk, putting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He knew that he had finally gotten to Kirk's problem. You would have done the same thing, Jim. Don't blame Henley or yourself for what happened. But if you keep up this guilt trip and don't get some rest, you may just do something that you will be responsible for. Kirk turned around slightly. Are you going to file another one of those medical log entries? McCoy grinned a little. That's not my job anymore, Captain, but I personally know someone who would do so at my request. The smile faded as McCoy's face became that of a seriously concerned friend. Jim, do yourself and me a favor. Get some rest. Kirk smiled slightly and nodded. I will, once we get underway. It's 13 hours to Ganeth, and if we don't meet any company, I promise to use that time to sleep. McCoy nodded in satisfaction. Good. Just in case, I'll make sure that Spock comes by and tucks you in. Kirk smiled slightly, his mood being lightened. In the old days, you would have sent a good-looking yeoman to do that. Afraid he'll take Spock to carry out your request? McCoy grinned as he walked to the door, turning in the doorway as it opened. No, I just want to make sure that you do get some sleep and not some midnight calisthenics. Kirk smiled wryly as McCoy left, half expecting Janice Rand to be right there with a plate full of green leaves that McCoy always called a nutritionally balanced meal designed for the safe reduction of excess weight. In many ways, Kirk missed those days. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, letting his mind drift off to his favorite thoughts of the days of sea breezes and unfurled sails. The hour passed by, as though comprised of mere seconds, rather than 60 minutes. James Kirk entered the main bridge again, almost immediately noticed the sounds and lights of the various repaired and replaced consoles. The smudged spots left by the fires had been cleaned again. Only a slightly darker shade of gray told where they had been. He slowly walked to a new command chair and the clean floor surrounding it. Kirk made a mental note to thank Scotty later. Kirk sat gently in the chair, gazed at the view screen for a moment, then swiveled to Uhura. Inform the Ravager that we are ready to get underway. She nodded in response as he turned to Spock's station. Since Savage's technician had been working on the scanners, Spock had been like a young child on Christmas morning with a pile of new toys. Kirk smiled slightly to himself. What type of help did we get on sensors, Mr. Spock? Spock looked up from the sensor readout, almost with a smile on his face. Long-range sensors have been increased 20%, 35% in scan definition. Short-range scanners have been increased only 12% in range, but the scan detail has been raised by 69%. The ability to detect a cloaked ship has been raised to 63% on short-range scan, and we are able to detect the difference between a Klingon cloak device and that of a Romulan. Kirk tilted his head somewhat to show that he was more than impressed. That's a great deal of improvement for 1 hour. Spock nodded slightly. Lieutenant Holder is extremely skillful in the field of sensor equipment. Kirk smiled again. Spock was just as impressed as he was, but would never admit to it. He turned to the helm station. Commander Phelps, let's get this show on the road. Set course for Ganeth 2 at warp 4. Aye, sir, Phelps responded as he set the course for the great ship. Going to warp speed. The Ravager has taken a position 20 kilometers off our rear starboard side and is cloaking. ETA for Ganeth 2 is 13.2 hours at present speed of warp 4. Very good, Commander, Kirk replied as he watched the twinkling stars give way to a burst of spectrum, then forming multicolored lines as Enterprise went from impulse to warp speeds. Kirk sat there for a few moments, staring at the sight before him, then stood and walked toward the turbolift. Gentlemen, we have 13 hours before planetfall, and I realize that your shift ended about 6 hours ago. I suggest that it's time we all try to get some rest before we run into any more problems out here. I don't want any of you fighting fatigue when situations may require 110% alertness. He saw Uhura nodding slightly in agreement. Kirk looked towards Phelps. Commander, let's get the next shift up here so we can get some rest. He looked around the bridge again. But despite the time lost, I want us all back up here in 10 hours. Sooner if an emergency comes up. The next rotation shift being called now, Captain. Kirk nodded to Phelps and looked briefly at Spock. Kirk had forgotten about asking the Vulcan what the secret was that he and McCoy shared, but thought there would be a better time for that. Spock looked back with the emotions of a brick wall. Still, Kirk could tell there was a slight twinge of something there. Then it came to him, and he smiled. That means you too, Spock. He smiled slightly, as he remembered the old times all too well. You can play with your new toy later. Spock lifted an eyebrow. I would hardly call the sensor a new toy, Captain, nor are they mine to play with. I do, however, understand your suggestion, and shall do so. Kirk just smiled and shook his head slowly. Some things are universally constant. He entered the turbo lift after waiting for the next shift of officers to exit. Jim turned before the doors closed to see that Spock's gaze had followed him. The Vulcan looked as perhaps there was something else that he wanted to comment on. But, Kirk thought, if that was something very important, Spock would have. He sighed wearily. Whatever it was, it could wait until later. All went well with the journey to Ganleth 2 since Kirk had left the bridge, until the comm buzzed 9 hours and 3 minutes later. Kirk awoke with a start, automatically hitting the comm switch next to the bed. Kirk here. Captain, this is Lieutenant Brinks. Long-range sensors are picking up a ship in front of us. It's moving diagonally from our port to starboard. We will intercept in 8 minutes at present speed. Any word from the Ravager? They sent a transmission 15 minutes ago, saying that they were changing course momentarily, but they didn't give a reason. The voice filtered over. All right, reduce to full impulse and go to yellow alert. I'll be right up. Recall Alpha Shift. Aye, sir, came the reply. Kirk groaned as he tried to sit up and failed. I'm getting too old for this, he said out loud. Actually, he felt younger than he had for... He couldn't remember exactly since when. Probably since he last saw Carol. He attempted to set up again, and did so this time. After putting on the red uniform tunic, he sprinted out into the corridor for the turbo lift. Somehow, and not really to his surprise, Spock had gotten there slightly ahead of him and was waiting at the turbo door lifts for him with an expectant look. Trouble, Captain. The bridge has picked up a ship on long-range sensors that will be crossing our path, and Savage has taken off on some joyride. Joyride, Captain? Spock questioned with a raised eyebrow. Sorry, Spock, Kirk said with an apologetic tone as they entered the lift. For some reason, the Ravager changed course about 15 minutes ago without explanation. It could be that they detected the approaching ship before we did and continued on ahead for a more detailed reading, Spock replied bluntly. Or they may be positioning themselves in case a battle situation arises. Kirk nodded. He hadn't really thought about the reasons why Savage may have left. He was just mad about Savage not informing them as to why. Of course, if the scenarios Spock proposed were true, then Savage would not have wanted to say anything for fear of the transmission being intercepted. The lift deposited the two on the bridge. Phelps was already there. Apparently, he had already been on his way to the bridge. Kirk caught a glance from the officer that had called him on the comm system. Lieutenant Brinks turned out to be a petite and very attractive lady in her late 20s. The shoulder-length brown hair and sparkling blue eyes did not distract from the slight blush that was appearing on her cheeks when she realized that Kirk was looking at her in more than a casual way. Lieutenant Brinks, Phelps called, you may go off duty now. The rest of Alpha Shift will be here momentarily. The officer turned slightly to look at Phelps. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Her bright blue eyes glanced ever so slightly at Kirk as she left the bridge. Kirk didn't know whether he should hit Phelps or just remain silent. Ah well, he thought, work now, maybe play later. Perhaps he wasn't too old for this after all. Phelps caught the slight red heat from Kirk and realized that he may have just unintentionally stepped on a nerve. He decided it would probably be best just to take his station and pretend that he had not noticed anything. "Captain," Spock called from the sensors, "the ship we are approaching is of a design that I am unfamiliar with. However, it is Klingon. I just cannot detect whether it is a warship. Computer records cannot identify either." Kirk sat down in the new command chair and stared into space that was displayed on the screen. Could it be a trade ship? Unknown. The size would indicate a freighter or troop carrier. However, the power output would not be indicative of either. "Have they detected us yet?" Spock shook his head. "Not yet. We are still out of its scanning range. Normally, we would just now be registering it on scan. We will be in its scanning range in 2.63 minutes. Intercept now in 15 minutes at full impulse." Kirk nodded absently and thought. He turned slightly as Uhura entered the bridge, along with the navigator and engineering officer. Kirk glanced over at the weapons station and saw that it was still empty. "Commander Phelps," Kirk motioned over at the empty station to his left. "Do we have an officer for the weapons station?" Phelps glanced at the parcel booth. "Yes, sir. She should be here momentarily. I have tactical switch to my station for the moment." Just as he had finished, the weapons officer ran through the door to head for her station. Kirk followed her movements with a twinge of anger, but realized that the recall had only been given a few minutes ago. In the old days, he would have just given the officer a good prayer meeting, as McCoy often called it, but now he was just glad to have the station manned. Kirk glanced at Phelps. The look that Phelps gave the weapons officer certainly wasn't as forgiving as his own. He imagined that Phelps would give her a lecture at a later time. He smirked. Perhaps Phelps was going to be more than a competent captain one of these days. "Captain, shall we raise shields?" Phelps asked, turning back to look at his readouts. "Not yet, Commander. Let's see what that ship does first. Full mag on the view screen." The image on the viewer changed to show the steel-gray shape of a Klingon ship. To Kirk and the rest, it looked like some type of Monitor-class ship, or perhaps a cargo freighter. This idea changed, however, when the ship activated a cloaking device and disappeared off the visual scan. "At least that lowers the possibility that the ship is anything but a warship," Phelps said. Kirk nodded in agreement. Klingons certainly did not waste resources by cloaking cargo ships. Kirk turned slightly in the direction of the science station. "Spock, are you detecting it on scans?" "Affirmative. The ship has changed course and speed to put them at 260 degrees Mark 15. They have gone to half impulse, and I am detecting an increase in power levels." "Are they preparing to fire?" Kirk asked as he got to walk over to Spock. "It does not appear that it is a weapons system that is being powered, but rather something toward the aft section of the ship." An eyebrow went up in puzzlement. "Scans cannot give me detailed information. It may be related to their engines." Kirk looked over his shoulder toward the starfield on the screen. He saw only empty space, but knew full well that it wasn't as empty as it appeared. "Bring all weapons to ready status and target the area that is currently under sensor scan." He afforded a glance at the weapons officer. "Raise shields and go to red alert." The officer complied as best she can. "Shields up. Phasers and photon torpedoes ready." "Sir, I can't get a weapons lock," she informed Kirk as she looked at her targeting scanner. It showed only a field of static. The ship was in that static area somewhere, but the field was too large to allow for accurate firing. Kirk smiled. "Go to manual targeting and do the best you can. Prepare to fire torpedoes and follow up with phasers when in range." The smile of confidence from Kirk relaxed the weapons officer somewhat. "Yes, sir," she replied. Switching from automatic to manual caused the torpedo guidance grid pattern to stop flashing its red warning of an inability to lock on the target. She positioned the grid to the center of the static cloud. The phaser targeting circle was likewise placed, only set just above the left side of the photon grid. Weapons range in 80 seconds, Captain. Again, Kirk nodded. He could tell that she was nervous, but he didn't think she was the type to freeze up when it was time to act. Prepare to fire. On board the Klingon A8 Highlander-class carrier, the captain could scarcely believe his luck. A Federation cruiser, by itself, was coming within weapons range. The excitement among the bridge officers were mounting. After a dull mission of practicing maneuvers with the 20 fighter ships on board, this was the type of break that they needed. The Highlander was a new class of ship that had yet to be put into actual battle. The captain growled in delight to himself. It was time to remedy that situation and grab some of the glory for himself. Captain Darg looked down to his tactical officer. Have all flight crews manned their ships? Yes, Captain. All fighters powered up and standing by for your order to launch, the officer replied with a tooth-filled grin. Darg stroked his beard with an equally toothy smile. He flexed his left hand, enjoying the crunching sound of his leather glove as he did so. The Federation ship was almost within torpedo range. Ready torpedoes. Prepare to disengage cloaking shield. We will fire all torpedoes and continue parallel with their ship. When we are equal to them, launch fighters and fire aft weapons when we have a clear shot. The weapons officer laughed deeply as he transmitted the orders to the fighter craft. The Federation ship won't even have time to talk their way out. The captain gave a deep laugh. This will be a short but important victory for the Klingon Empire. Darg knew full well that it was not the firepower of his own ship that mattered. Had a Federation ship been a destroyer or scout class, his ship's 6 disruptor banks would be equal to them in firepower. But it was the 20 Baruta fighters in the aft bay that would tear apart the bigger ship before it could even make a phaser lock. The new fighters did not have warp capability, but at full impulse they could easily outmaneuver any larger vessel and wear away its shields with twin disruptors and the 2 photon torpedoes slugging under their nose. What damage the fighters did on their own would only add to the salvo of fire from the carrier. Darg thought about the 2 escort ships that had been assigned to their practice maneuvers, but went on their own patrol areas when they had finished. Their added firepower would have been welcome, but then that would take all the challenge out of it. More importantly, he would have had to share the glory. The Klingon captain looked at the screen again and smiled as the Federation cruiser slowly closed the distance, unaware of his cloaked ship. His taste of victory suddenly became very bitter when the Federation ship fired 4 red flares of antimatter in his direction. By the time he yelled for evasive and the carrier had completed 5 degrees of its unfinished turn, the photon torpedoes struck the ship. The ship sputtered into visibility as the cloaking device shorted out, sending arcs of energy across the hull. The first torpedo had hit the ventral side of the main hull, causing only slight damage, but enough to knock out the cloak. Torpedo 2 detonated on the outer side of the port and cell pylon, causing the pylon to spin off into space. The carrier tilted towards the port side, only to be battered back to the starboard side as torpedo number 3 exploded in the center of the main hull by the command boom. The 4th torpedo missed the target, speaking onward through space like a small comet of doom. Hold on phaser fire, Kirk ordered. Those torpedoes may have sufficed. Damage report, Spock. They have sustained heavy damage to all systems. Weapons are inoperative. Engines offline. Shields are down. And life support is minimal. There are still energy readings from the aft sections, probably leakage from the impulse engines, or an attempt to flush energy buildup from the warp drive. Kirk looked at the drifting wreck of the ship. He had assumed that it may have been a light cruiser of some sort, but was still unsure as to its actual class or function. The The sensor board in front of Spock issued a warning. Spock looked quickly at the readout. "Sir, another cloaked ship is heading for us at full impulse." Kirk spun around from Spock to the view screen. "Get ready to lock phasers on target." "Sir, it's the Ravager," Spock quickly informed him as the ship began to decloak. "All of its weapons are fully armed and is targeting the Klingon ship." "Savage must be anxious to blow something away," Kirk replied as he waited for Savage to realize that they had already disabled the Klingon ship and power down. The Ravager did no such thing. The tooth-laden shark's mouth lit up as it fired a torpedo into the open shuttle bay on the Klingon ship. The torpedo detonated as it struck one of the hovering fighters that had been preparing to launch an attack. The detonation destroyed the entire bay along with the 20 fighters within. The explosion also caused the nearby fusion reactors of the impulse drive, already unstable, to go critical. The entire aft end and most of the main hull erupted into flame and metal. Kirk gripped the arm of his chair in anger at the uncalled-for destruction that he had just witnessed. The resulting starburst of flame is all that Kirk saw. He was completely unaware of the fighters that were but seconds from launching. "Uhura, get Savage on the comm, now," he ordered with rage. He did not need to have Spock scan for any survivors. That type of destruction would never allow for life to continue. "Sir," Uhura called, "I have Captain Savage on the line." "Put him on, Commander," Kirk said, red-faced. It was times like this when he wished there was some sort of room attached to the bridge that would allow for private communications. There were some choice words he would very much like to give Savage in private. The bearded face appeared on the screen, just as red and angry as Kirk. "What the hell are you doing, Kirk? I told you not to play games out here. That carrier was launching fighters. They would have sliced you up like a Thanksgiving roast." The anger suddenly drained from Kirk to be replaced by surprise. A carrier? What the devil was a carrier? He looked at Savage, puzzled. "What fighters?" "Kirk, that was a new carrier class that the Klingons have been developing. It carried 20 fighter craft that would have carved you up before you could get off a shot," he informed Kirk in a voice that still carried anger. "If the fighters didn't finish you off, that carrier would have. With you preventing the carrier's attack, had you neared them, its captain would have initiated a self-destruct as soon as you've gotten in range, just to destroy your ship." Savage moved closer to the screen. "Kirk, you had best decide right now as to whether you can deal with the situations out here. I can't be in two places at once, nor do I intend to play nursemaid on a 24-hour basis. Either you get mean and do what has to be done, or go back home where it's safe and let me handle the situation." That was it, Kirk thought, as the monster of anger reared its head again. He never did like getting chewed out for his actions, whether they were deserving or not, but it especially got his ire when the chewing was being done by someone that was not much older than a good bottle of Saurian brandy, and even worse, in front of his crew. He prepared to let loose his own volley when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Kirk did not even need to look around. The grip was one that was very familiar. "Jim, despite his emotions, Savage is correct." Kirk muted the comm and turned to the Vulcan. "Of all people, Spock, you agree with his actions?" Spock shook his head. "I believe there should be, and are, other ways to deal with situations other than by using violence. However, Savage has more experience in dealing with matters in this sector, and I would tend to give him the benefit of the doubt. This incident proves that he is more prepared to deal with situations than we are." "How so?" Kirk asked, puzzled. "We did not know the nature of that ship, nor the danger that it represented until it would have been too late for defensive action. If our goal is to see this mission through, and if that requires that we take such actions as his to be standard and required, then logically we must do the same." Spock looked back at the screen. "When we cannot act as we wish, we must act as we can." Kirk nodded in agreement. He hit the comm system switch a little too hard. "All right, Captain, I can play hardball too." He turned to the weapons officer. Until I order otherwise, Lieutenant, you will fire upon any enemy vessel until it is rendered unable to muster any form of attack. Understood?" She nodded slowly. "Aye, sir." She had always been taught to use the minimum of force when such an order went against everything that she had been taught at the academy. Kirk looked back at Savage. "Satisfied?" Savage nodded. He had lost some of his anger, but his face was still flushed. "Try not to get your armor too tarnished, Captain." Communications were shut off abruptly, leaving the bridge very silent. Kirk stood up as he watched the Ravager vanish on screen. "Spock, take the con. I'll be in my quarters." Spock nodded without a word, knowing full well that Kirk was going to be in a bad mood for some time. Kirk entered his quarters in a huff, desperately wishing there was something, or even better, someone, that he could hit. He quickly sat down at the desk and stabbed a comm switch. "Commander Uhura, contact Commodore Peterson on Starbase 10 and put it on down here." "Yes, sir," came the reply as Kirk tapped his fingers and waited, looking around the small room. He had momentarily thought about transferring his items to the larger captain's quarters, but decided against it. He didn't like Henley in life, but he could at least respect him in death. Peterson's face appeared on the view screens seconds later. "What's up, Jim?" His voice filled with apprehension. "I just wanted to check in and see if anything new has come up," Kirk asked, his voice not quite empty of resentment. Peterson could tell that there was another reason for the call by Kirk's tone, but shook his head in response. "Not yet. The Council is still debating what to do. Ganeth is a neutral planet in neutral space, and as such, we have to remain neutral as well." Politics, Kirk thought. "And if Ganeth calls for help while under attack, we do have an obligation to aid them if such circumstances come up and do not violate the Prime Directive." "Jim, you're just talking to the messenger here. Some members of the Council are willing to protect Ganeth, even if it means war. Others are willing to let Ganeth be sacrificed if it will maintain peace." Peterson took a breath. "Right now, Jim, the word is that you can only offer non-military aid, regardless of what happens. You can protect yourselves, but that's it." "And if Ganeth decides they want to be classified as a Federation colony?" Kirk asked. A frown appeared on Peterson's face. "You know the politics as well as I do, Jim. Ganeth won't be the first to do that. Technically, they can't be considered a Federation colony until their charter is approved. If they were within Federation space, or at least close by, we could give them protection before then, if they were under the threat of immediate attack. But, with Ganeth being in the Triangle, and so far from our border and close to the Romulans, there may not be many that would consider that an option. Do you believe that there's a good chance for the Romulans to attack?" "I don't know, White," he admitted, "but Captain Savage believes an attack is very likely." Peterson nodded, hearing the real reason for Kirk's irate tone. "Well, if Savage thinks that, you can bet money on it." Kirk neared the screen. "I also wanted to ask you about Savage. Just what is his part in this?" Peterson smiled and leaned back in his chair. About time Kirk came out with it. "I thought as much. What'd he do? Cuss you out?" "Royally," Kirk replied with a deep frown. "If he was a junior officer of mine, I'd bust him down for insubordination." Peterson almost laughed. "I know how you feel, Jim. We've had to put up with you for a few years." Kirk frowned slightly. He didn't know quite how to take that comparison. "He's a good man, Jim, despite appearances," Peterson continued. "He knows how to handle things out there in ways that they don't teach at the academy." Kirk nodded in agreement. "I have no doubt that he knows his job. It's just the way that he solves his problems that have me concerned. He uses a little excessive force, in my opinion." The smile faded almost instantly, and Peterson moved slightly in his chair. "You mean the way he handled those Klingons, don't you?" Kirk nodded. I have no great love for them myself, White. In fact, Savage has saved us from a very possible pounding, but there are ways in dealing with another race with civility. And with the Federation negotiating for peace with the Klingons, I would think that is even more now. Peterson was silent for a moment. Although Kirk had basically prevented an all-out war with the Klingons and saved the current Chancellor's life, he knew deep down how Jim Kirk felt about Klingons. Jim, you've never been in the Triangle before, have you? Not like this, no. The only time I was here was just for a brief period, mostly just passing by. I've been in and around the Triangle for nearly 9 years now, and I'll tell you, it's like nothing you could ever have known before. It's full of smugglers, pirates, slave traders, spies from every race, Klingons, Romulans, Orions, and who knows what else. He neared the screen slightly. There are individuals in there that are trying their best to get a rep for being the meanest SOB in the galaxy. Ship officers that will do anything to get ahead, and they can because it's all neutral space. It's a different breed of people out there. Peterson smirked, but not in humor. They literally go by the theory of survival of the fittest. Eat or get eaten, kill or be killed, adapt or die. The brass at Starfleet doesn't understand because they never come out here. They're too busy shining their seats with their butts and pushing papers. He paused. You know the type. So you condone what Savage does out here? Kirk asked, not really believing what he was hearing from White Peterson. I'm not saying that everything Savage does is correct, but he will do whatever he must to survive and to carry out a mission. He knows the ins and outs of the Triangle and how to handle the politics. He looked at Kirk and saw that he was finally getting through. Just don't judge him too harshly, Jim. He knows the area. You don't. Just what Kirk didn't want to hear. All right, White, I'll follow Savage's lead. After all, he has saved the ship 3 times. Just do what you have to do to get to the bottom of all of this. Savage can be rough and disrespectful, but I couldn't think of anyone I would rather have in my corner when the going gets tough out there. I think you will learn to appreciate having him behind you if you get into a jam. Kirk nodded. Okay, White. I'll contact you when we find out something, but as soon as you get the word from the Council about what we can and can't do, don't wait until Christmas to let me know. Peterson smiled. You got it, Captain Kirk. Peterson out. Kirk turned off the view screen and sat back in the chair. He didn't know if he should feel better or worse after that. He still wished that he had a voodoo doll of Savage right now, but Peterson was right. In the Triangle, he couldn't think of anybody he would rather have behind him for backup either.